There are exemptions to the foreign buyer ban. Most people don't know. It's a best kept secret. Follow me. I'm going to show you how you, as a foreign buyer, can buy in Canada under one of the exemptions. Let's go. So when you quickly glance through the legislation, it's pretty succinct, it's pretty refined. And at first blush, you've got the obvious exemptions, and then you've got the not so obvious exemptions. So let me talk about the not so obvious exemptions. When you look at the legislation, residential property for the purposes of this act refers to any real property or movable other than a prescribed real property or movable. And then go on to talk about what that means a little bit. What they don't do is elaborate on what the prescribed real property or movable refers to. Now, to figure out what that definition means, we look at the Canadian Gazette that elaborates a little bit on this. And when you look at prescribed and you look at residential property exclusion, section 3.1 says, for the purposes of the portion of the definition of residential property in section 2 of the Act, before paragraph AA, a property that is located in an area of Canada that is not within either a census agglomeration or a census metropolitan area is a prescribed property or immovable. Now, that means this particular sentence refers to this particular exemption. What are these exemptions? Okay, so now we have to dive a little bit deeper and understand what a census agglomeration is or a census metropolitan area is. Okay, so looking at the different data points on a CA or a CMA, there's websites where you can identify which property types may be exempt. So on this website, if you look at, for example, Barrie, and you look at the actual map here, what you can see is anything that has a gray outline is within a census metropolitan area or a census agglomeration. However, anything that doesn't, that's in the light gray here, is actually exempt. Meaning if you were to buy a property in Oro-Medonte, technically the foreign buyer ban doesn't apply. Now, there are non-resident speculation tax considerations, but that's a different topic. What we understand is that anything that is outside of a census metropolitan area or a census agglomeration would be exempt from the foreign buyer ban. Now, there's another really great website that you can use to help identify properties very quickly. So if, for example, you look at Toronto and you search for it, you can see that Toronto, for example, is identified census subdivision within census metropolitan area, meaning a foreign buyer cannot buy a type of property that isn't exempt in this area. If, on the other hand, you look at, for example, Tiny, you can see here, it says that Tiny is outside of a census metropolitan area or a census agglomeration, meaning that a foreign buyer can purchase a property that would otherwise be banned under the foreign buyer ban. Now, going back to the main page here, the other exemptions that are a little bit more apparent include the fact that the foreign buyer ban doesn't apply to any property that contains more than 3 dwelling units. So if you're buying a 4-plex or a 5-plex, the foreign buyer ban may not apply. Now, although the foreign buyer ban may not apply, the non-resident speculation tax may apply. And if you're a foreign buyer looking to exploit that exception, you need to understand the implications of the non-resident speculation tax being applicable to that specific transaction. Now, going over the other exemptions, if you are married to a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, and you and your spouse, either cohabiting spouse, common law spouse, within the confines of the definition of a spouse in this legislation, purchase a principal residence, that transaction would be exempt and you would be able to purchase the property. Now, it's very important that it's a principal residence, which means that only you and your spouse should be taking title. If you add in a cosigner or a guarantor, even for a minor share, that will potentially taint the entire transaction, meaning that it would not fall under one of the exemptions. Now, there's 3 other exemptions. The first of those exemptions is when we're dealing with eligible students. Now, if you're a student, these are the qualifying criteria to be exempt. They're very specific, they're very strict. You need to understand how they apply. 1, you have to have filed tax returns for 5 of the taxation years preceding the purchase. The second requirement is that you have to have been physically present in Canada for a minimum of 244 days in each of the 5 calendar years prior to the preceding year of the purchase. 3, you can't buy a property more than $500,000. If you're buying in GTA, that really limits your scope. This may not be a valid exemption for you. And lastly, you cannot have purchased more than 1 residential property. All 4 of these requirements have to be fulfilled in addition to the institution qualifying. Now, the second exemption is if you're under a work permit. as a temporary worker under a work permit, you've got to satisfy these requirements. The three main requirements are that you have to have been working in Canada for at least 3 years within the preceding 4 years prior to your acquisition. You have to have filed all of your income tax returns for 3 out of the 4 preceding years before the purchase, and you cannot have purchased more than one residential property. Now, if the student or the worker exemption applies to your scenario and you're able to buy that property and you're not banned by this actual legislation, there are non-resident speculation tax considerations. Currently, the non-resident speculation tax is 25%. And although previously students and workers who eventually became permanent residents or Canadian citizens could apply for a rebate, those rebate provisions have now come to an end. Meaning if you are exempt as a student or somebody with a valid work permit falling under one of the exemptions that we've discussed, you may still end up paying 25% tax under the non-resident speculation tax regime. Now, the remaining exemption that I'm going to cover for the purposes of this video are the exemptions under Section 2. Under subsection 2, it says very clearly that any sort of an acquisition resulting from death, divorce, separation, or gift would also be exempt from this legislation. Now, although there may be certain loopholes around this legislation, including some of the exemptions that I've talked about today, it's very important that you understand that as a foreign buyer, the non-resident speculation tax may apply. If you're a foreign buyer and you fall under one of these exemptions, or you buy a property that is exempt, you need to carefully consider the non-resident speculation tax exemptions, which now apply all over Ontario and are taxable at a rate of 25%. Ricky Rathore here again, broker owner at Remax Metropolis, real estate lawyer, Rathore Baig Professional Corporation. We'll see you again next time. Bye for now.